And I always said I was on the treadmill of life for 25 years. And now I want to get off.
After a lifetime of rushing, stress, and anxiety, Beth was ready to take action. For years, she had suspected something was not quite right.
Mental health was such a taboo subject for so many years. You hid it in shame. It was the family secret. You didn't want the neighbors to know. You didn't want your colleagues to know. But I think it's freeing to say, I'm human. I have frailties. I have issues. And I want to work towards getting better.
Undiagnosed ADHD doesn't just affect focus, it's linked to relationship difficulties, anxiety, and financial stress. And more seniors are being diagnosed with ADHD than ever before. Unison TV talked with a University of Calgary clinical neuropsychologist about why older adults are getting diagnosed and how it's being treated. But first, more on how Beth's journey has helped her understand who she's always been.
I was the silent kid. I was the messy kid in our family. Um, it was more as I got into my teens. I was that procrastinator with schoolwork. Um, I ended up going off to nursing school, and I really thrived because I could focus on the work, because I liked the work. In high school, I did very poorly because I wasn't interested and I was distracted, and I'd rather go for a walk than sit through biology and chemistry. But as I say, I could get super focused if it was something I was interested in. And still to this day, as an adult, I'm a quilter. If I don't finish the quilt in 2 weeks, it doesn't get done. So I'm a bit like whirling dervish in that I put my mind to it to make a quilt, and I sew like mad for 2 weeks till it's completed. I'm forgetful, and I always have been at misplacing glasses, phone, keys, etc. And it's just something that I thought was me. I thought it was just me. You're being careless. You're not remembering. Um, And then when my daughters were young, 8, 10 years old, I would be tidying their room, and I found myself bouncing from room to room. I would start to tidy one room, and I think, oh, I've got to change the laundry. I go and change the laundry, and then I'd do something in the kitchen, and then I think, oh, darn, I'm supposed to get back and finish the girls' rooms. Um, I learned to carry my kitchen egg timer with me because I was frustrated. I was frustrated in, as my family calls it, ping-ponging. They have said that I ping-pong all my life. Mom, sit down, you're ping-ponging. Mom, just do one thing at a time. So once I started carrying this around with me, I would set it for 15 minutes, and I couldn't leave the room until the timer went off. I've found it useful in many ways, but now I use my phone to put the timer on. I am a perfectionist when it comes to schoolwork, quilting, my house. My house has to be perfect all the time. We have a little running joke in the family. My son-in-law sent me a text on Christmas morning, and he said, Bethy, it doesn't have to be perfect. So I put a sign on the door that says, Kyler, it's all perfect. Because I think that's who I am. That's who I am. And I'll get myself in a tizzy for 5 days before Christmas or 5 days before Thanksgiving, getting everything organized and writing lists and sticking the lists on the fridge so I know exactly what I do when. Currently, we are building a new house. We're listing our house next Friday, and I have a list of 20 things that I need to accomplish in the next 2 weeks. And every day I go back and I think, did I miss anything? Did I miss anything? So I think I've wasted a lot of time over my life because of this potential ADHD diagnosis that I'm having investigated now. I'm exhausted, and I do it to myself. I do it to myself. I need to learn all of the strategies that will help me slow down. 2 years ago, my family doctor changed my medication, and it was a medication that has given me considerable peace in that it was effective, but we're considering bumping it up again. We have a family history of bipolar disorder, both my father, my brother, and one of my nieces. So my great fear was always that I was manic, that am I bipolar? Am I like them? So ADHD to me is a kinder alternative to bipolar. Well, the family doctor started me off on the lowest dose, and she said, it will take a while to work, but it's pretty quick. And within a few days, I felt better. I don't know if that was the placebo effect, me just being hopeful that it was working, but it certainly did bring me down a notch or two. I was in an ADHD study a year ago, and because it's a research study, they can't diagnose you. These are all professional educators that did the study, and my executive functioning was way off. That's the one thing they would tell me is that, and I realize that's true. That is paperwork. I've never been good. I have a pile of things like this on the desk that I think I've got to tackle those. Fortunately, my husband doesn't mind doing it. So paperwork and organizing files and how long should I keep them, and oh, I don't want to tackle that. So that is the one thing, the one highlight from the study that we did. And it was quite intensive. It was 6 hours of questioning and diagrams and quizzes and drawings, what comes next, brain games.
Sure. I am Brandy Callahan. I'm an associate professor of psychology at the University of Calgary, and I'm Canada Research Chair in adult clinical neuropsychology.
All right. Well, we'll start off with being diagnosed with ADHD at an older age. Is it more common, or are we just talking about it more?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think we're starting to recognize ADHD in groups that we weren't very good at recognizing it in before. So older people, women are two examples. And so I think because we're recognizing that it presents differently in certain groups of people, and we're learning how to recognize that different presentation, diagnoses are going up. And I do think we're talking about it more as a society. I think there's more sort of social and public awareness about ADHD in past childhood and in adults. And so as a result, I think people are recognizing themselves having ADHD and are sort of advocating for themselves. And I think healthcare providers are sort of getting better at recognizing it in sort of non-traditional groups as well.
How was it dealt with, say, in generations past with both men and women, say 20, 30 years ago?
I mean, ADHD in itself is a relatively new diagnosis. So the way that we define ADHD today, that definition has only been around since the late 60s. So really people who may have had it before then weren't necessarily diagnosed in childhood. So that's part of the reason that, older adults, may be getting diagnosed sort of later in life, in their 40s and 50s, because when they were kids, again, our current definition of ADHD wasn't formulated then. And I think that so that's part of why we're seeing sort of more later diagnoses in some groups. And I think relative to 30 and 40 years ago, we're recognizing, as I said earlier, that the presentation that is sort of classically assigned to ADHD, the hyperactive kid bouncing off the walls, like that's definitely one presentation, but that description of those symptoms was generated from, research studies conducted primarily on boys. And so we're getting to realize that in girls it looks quite different, in women it looks quite different, in older adults it looks quite different, and that aging processes and menopause and social expectations really play into how people might manifest their symptoms. So I think those are some advances in our understanding that are relatively newer.
How does it present differently in older adults?
Yeah, so in children, generally we see more sort of physical hyperactivity and overt restlessness. As people get older, that very obvious hyperactivity tends to fall away and may turn inward. So one of the changes that we see in relatively older people is they may still feel restless, but that restlessness is sort of more inwards. And sort of the more obvious presentation is relating to inattention. So distractibility, difficulty maintaining focus, though that's sort of the symptom profile that is more common in older adults. And of course can be exacerbated by normal aging, where in normal aging, we see that the regions of the brain that are associated with maintaining focus and working quickly on multiple tasks, those brain regions change with normal aging. And so those types of symptoms can, in someone who had pre-existing ADHD, those symptoms may become a little bit more obvious as they get older.
And do they present differently in older men versus older women?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So women, as a general rule, again, there's lots of individual variability here, but on a group level, typically what we see in women is more internalized symptoms of ADHD. So what that means is that basically instead of the symptoms presenting outwardly in terms of restlessness and hyperactivity, they may present more inwardly in the form of worry, of stress, of self-doubt, of shame. And so in women with ADHD, essentially these symptoms are often misdiagnosed as something else. So there's really interesting evidence emerging that women with ADHD are diagnosed on average 4 years later than men with ADHD. And if you look at the patterns of what happens to them during that 4-year gap, is they're being misdiagnosed as having, anxiety, depression, borderline personality disorder, bipolar disorder, because they're experiencing the same traits as men or the same symptoms, but they're manifesting as more inward facing. And so what that looks like is emotional dysregulation that can mimic some other psychiatric conditions. And so that is something that seems to be sort of more typical of the female experience navigating ADHD.
Before we go on, can you clear up something between ADHD and anxiety? Does one cause the other, or how do they interact?
So there's some evidence that ADHD can increase a person's likelihood of developing an anxiety disorder. And part of that seems to be this this experience of having ADHD where many people with ADHD realize that it takes them longer or it takes more energy for them to do things that seem very easy for other people. And so some of that, inner experience or mismatch between, why is it so difficult for me? And is there something wrong with me? Those types of internalized thoughts and emotions, there is some evidence that they may they may increase the likelihood that a person develops anxiety. I think regardless of what causes what, we see very common co-occurrence of ADHD and anxiety. So some studies report that as many as 50% of people with ADHD will also experience anxiety at some point in their life. So the causality is not completely clear, but what is clear is they co-occur very often. And anxiety can mimic some of the symptoms of ADHD as well, which makes things even more complicated. So if you're very anxious, you may have trouble focusing on things. You may be more distractible just from inner anxious experiences. So that makes the relationship even more complicated.
What are the long-term effects of not having it dealt with or diagnosed?
ADHD?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, undiagnosed ADHD implies also untreated ADHD. And so that can be challenging for a variety of reasons. The mental health consequences of untreated ADHD seem to be clear. So, as I said, many people with ADHD have a lot of shame, a lot of self-doubt, a lot of sort of confusion around, why is it so difficult for me to do things that seem so easy for other people? And as I just alluded to, that can, lead to or be associated with anxiety, depression. And so obviously the mental health consequences are quite clear. And also just the, sort of related to this is a person's sense of their selves and their core beliefs of who they are and what kind of a person they are. I'm a geriatric neuropsychologist. I work with mostly older adults, and a lot of the people that I work with have only recently received a diagnosis for the first time, like in their 50s. And a common theme of what these people say to me is a strange combination of relief at feeling like, oh, I finally understand what's been going on with me for all these years. And that's combined with lots of regret and this feeling of how might my life, like how could have my life been different if I had known this 40 years ago, and I could have been treated and I could have gotten the help that I needed. So the longer we delay the diagnosis, or the longer it takes for someone to be recognized and consequently receiving help, the more detrimental it can be for their sense of self and their mental health. And I'll also say that there are, again, lots of individual differences here, but on the group level, we know that ADHD is associated with things like relationship difficulties and patterns of conflict with other people. We know that it's associated with career challenges in many individuals. So, difficulty holding down a job, or, lots of job hopping between jobs, inconsistent, job performance. In some of my own research that I'm just wrapping up now, we find that ADHD is associated with difficulty repaying debts later in life. Having not too much money left over at the end of the month in older adults, dissatisfaction with one's financial situation. So all of these things, the longer ADHD is left unrecognized and untreated, these things could potentially have compounding effects over a person's lifetime. So obviously, yeah, earlier diagnosis, identification, and treatment options can really sort of mitigate those later life outcomes.
I think just you saying that combination of grief and relief in having the diagnosis and regret.
Yeah.
I think that's important for people to hear, because yeah, that's exactly what it seems like. I had a late in life diagnosis and there was so much regret, like, why didn't I get this done earlier? I would have been a better partner, a better mother, all those things, right? Do you hear those scenarios?
Absolutely, absolutely, all the time. And yeah, and I think it is a very difficult grieving process of, accepting where you're at now and in many people grieving the life that you think you could have had with treatment.
What do you tell patients, or do you get to that point, or is that more of a counseling question?
Yeah, the relationship that I have with the people that I work with is a research relationship. So, the people that I work with are very generous in volunteering their time and their efforts to participate in the research that we do. So I tend not to get into a counseling type of relationship with them, but obviously these questions come up, and so we do touch on some of these things. Mostly what I actually hear from the people that I work with is that they're very grateful that there is research being done on older adults, because lots of people reach out to me saying, I got my diagnosis 2 years ago and I've been trying to find help for 2 years. I've been Googling, I've been, talking to people trying to find answers. And they say, everything I find is for kids or parents with kids with ADHD, or even the stuff for adults is usually geared towards people in their 30s. It's not for people who are in their 50s or 60s. So a lot of the feedback I get is gratefulness that we're doing the research that we're doing.